Hello, and welcome to Transforming Language Education, the vodcast series where we will talk about the future of teaching, inquiry, and advocacy in language education. I'm Jen Crawford.
And I'm Rob Philback. Please like or subscribe if you want to join us in helping to transform language education.
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Today on the show, we're excited to have Christian Chun. Christian is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He's the author of several books, including Power and Meaning Making in an EAP Classroom, Engaging with the Everyday. He taught ESL for many years in Los Angeles, brings a vast array of experiences to this field. We're really excited to talk with him. This is part one of a three-part series.
Yeah, and in part one, we'll focus on language use and identities in the classroom. In part two, we'll focus on critical pedagogies in the language classroom, particularly the ESL and EAP classroom. And in part three, we will focus on which English should be taught in the classroom. Hi, Christian, and welcome to Transforming Language Education.
Thank you, Jen and Rob. Thank you for inviting me.
So maybe to kick it off, as we think about language use and identities in this first segment, Christian, maybe just let's start with a broad question in terms of how do we see our students as teachers?
Well, that's a very important question. And I think it relates to the societies and the cultures in which we grew up in terms of, on one scale, the media representations, be it Hollywood films, television, news reports, school curriculum, and how they portray people in particular ways. I'll give one example that I've been writing about is the idea around how Asian Americans are now seen as the quote unquote model minority. And that in a book published a few years ago called The Asian American Achievement Paradox, in which now many high school, many K through 12 teachers view their Asian American students as being brilliant students, great students, even though maybe their test scores don't always validate that perception. But by bringing that assumption in, it actually facilitates and perpetuates, not only cultural tropes, but also, of course, the impact on the students' achievements as well. So I think in terms of the ways in which we view our students, we would have to kind of self-examining how and why we see them in a certain way beyond the individual, on the individual level.
Christian, this reminds me of something my mom would say often, which she was a elementary and ELD teacher for almost 40 years. And she would say, to assume makes an ass out of you and me. And that always stuck with me. And I wonder if you have some examples about how teachers might go ahead and identify and leverage students' sociocultural, linguistic, content or professional knowledge in the classroom, especially because I know many of the teachers who are really eager to affirm students and their identities can often jump to conclusions. I remember a long time ago when I was at UCLA working with a teacher who was so excited and passionate about social justice and said, oh, I'm going to go to South LA and I'm going to teach this language curriculum, I'm going to teach this English class about, and I'm going to relate it to hip hop. And it turned out that he didn't ask, and many of the students liked banda instead. That he, that there was oftentimes will jump to what is culturally relevant, what is sustaining, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you can give us any guide on how we might identify and leverage students' background knowledges without making assumptions or leaning too hard or questioning our own biases.
Right. And so this is actually something that I talked about in my presentation at the TESOL conference this past March in Pittsburgh, in which I think important classroom approach would be to have teachers do an autoethnography with the students so that the students present their own lived experiences, whether it's through written form essays and or oral presentations in a class, and to devote a particular class time so that students will be presenting about their experiences, not only sharing it with the teacher, but also importantly, of course, with their fellow classmates. And I think this is important, where this would literally, in turn, like just opening up the windows of like, oh, okay, or oh, I didn't know about that. Oh, okay, interesting, and going beyond that, breaking down that assumptions that many of us make throughout our teaching practices. That is the somewhat of the norm, but to break that normative behavior, I think that's important with the presentation of autoethnographies.
It's so fascinating, and it feels like many of the themes that we've even talking about with other guests in our podcast, which is really understanding our learners as individuals, humanizing the classroom, not seeing them as part of a broader group or broad swath, or making assumptions. I wonder if you can even tease this out more. I'm thinking of something that you wrote about in terms of how we view how students and we view our own bodies, even how things like anorexia is played out in the classroom, in the language classroom. I just wonder if you can talk about that in terms of, again, an example of seeing our students for who they are, humanizing and not essentializing them or making assumptions.
Right. So yeah. So that article that I wrote about the discourses around anorexia in an EAP classroom, and it was interesting in which the ways in which the students that some of them perhaps had not really thought about it much. So when they were interacting and engaging with that. With the video and the text, they had a lot of interesting responses to it, and again, it as always, it interrelates with the other, the interactional dynamics of identities, whether it's gender or sexuality, social class, and race, and how, again, this idea around in terms of the perceptions of the body also impacts the students. It's something that I think that it is not much addressed by teachers. I mean, part of that is, of course, the somewhat of a self-imposed inhibition, but it's also, of course, part of this mandated curriculum, and just in terms of sticking to the materials. But when these discourses, as it were, erupt in the classroom, again, I think it's important for teachers to address this, to have these conversations out in the open with that. So yes, going beyond, again, this idea around how, and it's also interesting just in terms of the gender identities, where there's also been some pushback, as you might know, about going beyond the binary pronouns, where some people, for whatever reason, they don't approve of the pronoun they. It's like, well, I mean, whatever pronoun you're choosing to identify, why do you care what other people choose to identify which pronouns? So.
Just to follow up two things. One, this idea that the way we talk about people and identities and bodies and how we embody these very identities is something so prevalent across so many language courses. I'm thinking of all of our former colleague, Ujanya, who talked about this in the context of learning in Portuguese and how people would refer to what would be idealized body types, and that being so different across different racial subgroups in different countries. But then coming back to this question of pronouns, I've had a lot of foreign language teachers or world language teachers ask us about that or bring this up. What are your recommendations for teachers on how to best teach, especially novice learners, pronouns, conjugation? Like what is sort of, I'm sure you get this question, we get it all the time. How do I address this in the class, especially for novice learners? Do you ever get that question? And if you do, how do you respond?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. So, and again, I rooted in both the history and then the present day events and culture. And, in one of my classes that I teach in the master's level program, one of the themes is around language and gender and sexuality. And it's where this, again, the assumptions before that were social linguists have addressed this idea that somehow, well, not somehow, but the ways in which it's been perceived that cisgender women and cisgender males talk differently. And that's been disproven again and again in terms of not that it is essentialized, but it's due in large parts to the ascribed assumptions of like, okay, if you are cisgender, for example, if you're a cisgender female, you're not supposed to interrupt or talk too much versus, where I'm going with this. And so there's this sexist and gendered prejudices and impositions on us. And I think it's important where novice learners not only are introduced to these concepts if they're not familiar with in the context of language here in the languages here in the US, but also if they're coming from other countries to kind of self-examine their own cultural backgrounds and assumptions with that, because yes, as we know, other languages, they have these, particular fixed pronouns with particular words.
Christian, it really seems, if you step back and think about what we're talking about, like, why wouldn't we dive into this in such a meaningful way? It has to do with who we are as individuals, who our students are, and it has to do with language and language use. And ostensibly, we're in language classrooms where these kinds of discourses occur, or these kinds of issues ought to be addressed. I just as we kind of wrap up here and think about this, are there other just sort of broad practical steps, or a tip or two as you think about our listeners and how we might collectively as teachers highlight or address our pedagogical blind spots in this area?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's something where, in terms of fostering a language awareness, not only on the part of teachers themselves, in which as educators, again, the self-reflexivity is important, in which we need to look back on our own language use and thinking about the ways in which we use language, and then unpacking that of like thinking about, okay, the assumptions around when we use particular words and those meanings, and of course how those meanings have shifted over time. And it's interesting where we might think about, for example, particular political slogans that have been used time and time again, and how actually within the given context, depending on who said it, it had different meanings and was intended to have different meanings. So again, I think it would connect it with the students in terms of not only students learning other languages, but also teacher educators, in which we're thinking about how the language use has always been fluid and changing, and thinking about ways in which we would jettison certain terms or phrases that have now been seen as not only anachronistic, but also harmful to many. I mean, there's so many examples, as you know.
Right.
But, yeah.
Well, thank you for really illuminating this area and helping us, as you said, even just move beyond the assumptions we make about the fixed curricula and what we ought to be teaching, or what we're supposed to be focusing on in the classroom, and really bringing into relief in a more reflective and metacognitive way what we're actually saying in that process, and how that impacts us and reflects on our identity and the identities of our students. Really, thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm Jen, this is Rob, and we're here with Christian. Thanks for listening.